That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G is specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441.
Hello and welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly podcast of the Free Speech Union. I'm Jan McVarish, and today I have a new guest, Connie Shaw, who is not just a guest but also a new staff member for the Free Speech Union. She's just joining us today, in fact, as External Affairs Officer. So hi, Connie.
Hi, Jan. Thanks for having me.
No, pleasure. So we don't know how we're going to work this out over the coming weeks, but I'm more than sure people will see an awful lot more of Connie. So tell us a little bit about what your role is going to be.
So as the External Affairs Officer, I will be reporting on the work of the Free Speech Union and promoting its work on broadcast platforms, TV, radio, social media. And that's what I'll be doing, just promoting the work of the FSU and hopefully expanding our reach to people who may need our help.
Brilliant. Well, that's all to the good. So let's talk a little bit more about how you came to our attention in some ways. So lots of our listeners probably and viewers probably are aware of you already. They'll have seen you talking about your story of what happened to you as a student at the University of Leeds. So tell us a little bit about that story for those people who haven't heard about it, and what it was that brought us to your attention and you to us to our attention.
Yeah, so in September 2024, which was the start of my third and final year at Leeds, I took up the role of daytime editor at Leeds Student Radio, or LSR, which I was elected to do. And that meant that I'd be overseeing the talk shows, so the political talk shows at LSR. And I also decided that I wanted to start my own podcast alongside it, alongside my committee role, but completely separate. It wasn't on LSR platforms. And I wanted my podcast to focus on the backlash to woke ideology and identity politics. I did my first episode. It was an account of the Reform UK conference, which I went to on a press pass. And my second episode was with Charlie Bentley-Astor, who's a journalist and also a detransitioner. And she took puberty blockers for 4 years and then came off them, stopped identifying as something other than her biological sex. And we spoke about how she was drawn into it and how it affected her and the concept of gender identity in general. And I knew at the time that there was going to be quite a bit of backlash. I was very aware of how controversial it was to discuss this topic from that point of view. So I was going into it with my eyes open, and someone in the society helped me edit the video, and he gave me loads of his free time. And when I advertised the episode on Instagram, I just credited him in the caption for his help. And he received a complaint against him from a separate society and was told that he must distance himself from me and my work going forwards. At that point, I purchased my FSU membership because I thought, well, if that's what they're going to do to someone who's simply helped edit the episode rather than had any input to do with the content, then what are they going to try to do to me? And so I became a member of the FSU probably around mid-October last year. And I continued with my podcast. We, as LSR, received 4 press passes to go to the Battle of Ideas, which is a free speech festival put on by the Academy of Ideas. And I interviewed Graham Linehan at that festival. Again, on my private podcast, I also interviewed other speakers as LSR. But I interviewed Graham as in my personal capacity, and that episode went out on my podcast. And the day after that episode went out, he published an article that I'd written for his Substack, which was about how gender ideology is absolutely everywhere at university and you don't have a choice as to whether you comply. And one of the examples in that article that I included was the fact that in the LSR office, there was a display wall for committee members where each committee member had a poster with their face on, a photo of their face and their name, a bio about themselves, and also next to their name, next to everyone's name, was their pronouns, including mine. And I had not been asked if I wanted my pronouns next to my name. I also hadn't been asked what my pronouns were, which was quite funny to me. And that was one of the examples I included. And then the next day, I was told by the student union that I had been suspended from my committee position, and my membership had been suspended as well, because I was being investigated for allegedly breaking the code of conduct of the society, for putting the health and safety of other members at risk, for not acting in a duty of basically not acting in a duty of care and not being selfless in the way that I sort of conduct myself, despite the fact that this podcast was entirely separate from
And was
my.
it a paid role then?
No, just
No.
voluntarily. So
Right.
every society has a committee, and I was
Yeah,
elected to
yeah,
that
yeah.
role. All my role really consisted of, up until that point, was going through the applications for the the 4 slots on each of the 5 shows. And so I would go through the applications and pick the best applications to be presenters on the show. And other than that, I left it very much up to the presenters as to what they wanted to talk about, as long as they were spending at least 70% of their show time speaking rather than playing music, because they were talk shows. Other than that, I was very much hands off, because when I presented a show in the previous semester, I really appreciated being able to have the freedom without being sort of having a helicopter sort of committee role person telling us what we should be talking about. So yeah, the presenters really had free reign of what they wanted to speak about. My only role was picking who was going to be on the show.
And did so the reaction of the committee to your external role, which presumably they were monitoring quite closely and then all talking about behind your back, did you get the feeling that that was something that was already starting to expand beyond just that one society? I mean, at what point did you feel like that went more broadly across the kind of the Leeds campus, or was it kind of relatively contained to start with?
Um, I think quite quickly it became discussed amongst students, only from anecdotal evidence. Well, not necessarily anecdotal. I saw evidence of students in group chats talking about my students I didn't know, who I'd never spoken to before. There was one group chat I was being referred to as far right and bigoted, and also I was accused of sort of upholding racism by platforming Reform UK, just by talking about the conference. My personal view in general is that all views should be expressed, and actually it's far better that people aren't silenced, because then we don't know who the dangerous people really are. So that's the kind of approach that I take
Yeah,
to things.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's funny. I took the approach the other week with this woman who was, slapping the label around, and I just said, "Well, I don't really care about that. That's not something that matters to me." And I thought and that's the truth of it, is I don't trust the label. And it's not that I'm particularly interested in far right ideas as opposed to other ideas. It's that it doesn't put me off. It doesn't,
Yeah,
because I know how the label is used. The line moves inwards all the time, doesn't it? So there's
yeah.
increasingly narrow kind of center ground. And but then to have that applied to you personally, and to be quite exposed on campus, I assume that's what that's like. Did you feel a little bit like you're walking around with a sort of target on the back of your head?
That's exactly how I felt, and that's exactly how I described it at the time. It did feel like I was, because you see these things online, but you can never tell how much other people actually know about it. Because sometimes you'll get a bit of backlash online, and you think, "Oh my god, everyone knows about
Mm,
this,
mm,
and everyone's thinking about it in this way." So I was kind of walking around, sort of looking over my shoulder, because I didn't know the extent of the feeling about it. So I was always quite to be honest, paranoid. Nothing bad, properly bad, ever happened on campus. But yeah, I was always conscious of the fact that something could happen like that. But yeah, feeling like I had a target on my back on campus, that's definitely how I felt. But again, nothing actually bad ever happened.
mm,
So
mm. Yeah, it's a funny one because I can only think of it that attempt to shame people, I can't think of a scenario that might have happened at university like that, other than if somebody had done something completely outrageous, like in the student union on a Friday night, they'd taken all their clothes off and kissed everybody's boyfriends. That would kind of be the thing that would mean you'd have a couple of weeks of hell. Or, or literally just, stealing a boyfriend or something like that, doing the dirty on somebody. And it would be personal because it was personal,
Yeah.
and then gossip and all of that kind of thing. So for it to have a bit more heft to it as for political reasons, I think is a bit different, isn't it? And worse because it's a harder label to shift. But it's weird how it kind of gets tangled up with a kind of gossip sense as well.
Yeah. And it was very clear that people were very happy to say things online, but no one ever said anything to my face. So,
Yeah, so this is funny, isn't it? Because this is what we hear all the time from, particularly from younger people, which is this experience of, on the one hand, you feel like you've been shamed and that you're now cast out, but on the other hand, you have people coming up to you and quietly saying, "Well, actually, I really agree with you," or "If I wish I was if I was a bit braver." And did you experience that then? Did you suddenly have sort of right-wing fanboys coming up to you?
I've definitely had, more so just in the final weeks of university, had those experiences where people have come up to me and said that they agree with me, including staff members, and which has been really lovely. Only once has someone, I mean, I have quite a lot of respect for these people because at least they are saying it to my face. Only once did someone come up to me. I was sat in a pub talking, actually having a debate with someone who disagreed with me, having a really civilized and really interesting debate. And out of nowhere, someone who I was not friends with, I'd probably been in the presence of a handful of times, but never actually spoken to before, came over to me. I was sat down, he was stood up over me, saying that he used to respect me, but he doesn't anymore because of what I say. And that was quite intimidating. But at the same time, fair enough, he said it to my face. I mean, his arguments are very poor. He didn't really know what it was that I'd said, because he was accusing me of saying things that I haven't said. So that's the only time where that's happened. And then every other time where someone who disagrees with me or was angry with what I've said, where they've said that to my face, that's when I've put myself in that position, knowing that will happen. So, for example, I went to a meeting set up by the Students' Socialist Society, where they were talking about trans rights. So I go into these situations knowing, because I'm so desperate to have this debate. I've tried at university to set something like this up because it's just a topic that you can't talk about, like the debating society at Leeds. I emailed them asking if they would host a debate between James S's and someone else on the other side of the argument. And their response to me was that they wouldn't do that because it's against their values to undermine the sovereignty of a marginalised community. So it's not like I hadn't tried. So I'd purposely go to these things like the display that Maeve and I set up on campus a couple of weeks ago, to try and encourage that debate to actually happen, because the opportunity to have it naturally at university isn't really there.
So this is where you went into the kind of public square on the campus and kind of had lots of printouts of statements, including some which said join the Free Speech Union, I think, which is full marks, probably clinched your job application. But then you attached them to like just picnic tables basically, and kind of, it was that, this approach which we see a lot online of kind of, come and ask me anything sort of approach, which I do think there's a lot in it, as long as it doesn't turn into gotchas. And actually, so did you have, when you did this with Maeve, another student who sort of has got similar views, did you find that there were people who were up for conversations?
Absolutely. We had many very good debates, constructive, some sort of going off into different, I mean, it's the typical arguments from certain perspectives that are quite, in my opinion, quite illogical and therefore difficult to argue against. And that way it's quite sometimes unconstructive. But yeah, we had some really good debates, had other just people trying to shout at us, call us transphobes and bigots. But on the whole, I think we did a really good thing. And actually, obviously, I would never specify, but the response afterwards, I'm very, very happy that we did that, because I think that some students feel very seen. And we did have people come up to us and come quite close, rather than stand in the audience or in the crowd and say, I agree with you. Or not, it's not that we wanted people to agree with us, but like I was saying, some students felt that they'd never seen anyone express this view on campus and they might have been scared to do so themselves. But we had people sort of walk up close to us and say, like, really well done, this is really great. I had one chap, he might have been a member of staff or maybe a mature student, said, sort of reading our signs, I was thinking, oh, what's going on, what's he thinking? And he just went, this is one of the most sensible things I've ever seen on campus, well done, and walked off.
Yeah, that's saying something. Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think that kind of exemplary behavior is really, it's a really great thing, and it does send a bit of a beacon out to people, doesn't it? Because if you can radiate openness and calmness, which does require you to really rise above a situation, and that's difficult. But once you start to do that, then you really are. I mean, that's where you see people become strengthened by the experience of cancellation, is because they've had to kind of say, okay, I understand why these people say this and they think that, and I think I understand it better, which is why I think I'm right. But I'm going to, my intention is to try and help people get to where I am.
Yeah.
And obviously, you know that people are not all going to agree with you, but at least when you sort of set yourself up in that way as slightly above the fray, it's, I think it's very helpful, and you can see people really develop when that happens. So what was it that, do you think, so in your first 2 years at university, were you keeping your mouth shut? Did you not know what you thought? I mean, what was the transition point?
So when I was at school, I was 15, 16 when we went into the first lockdown, and I very much bought into woke ideology, i.e. sort of obsession with victimhood. And as part of that, I just blindly agreed that, of course, trans women are women. I never thought any more deeply than that, other than, of course, if someone wants to identify that way, then we should respect and endorse that claim. And then throughout sixth form, I was running the Feminist Society with a friend. And at the end of sixth form, the school had a podcast and they asked me to interview a trans student in my year as a Pride Month special. And that's like half an hour conversation I had with this student who I considered a friend at the time, as in we don't speak to each other anymore, just when we left school. And that was the first time where I started to question things, and that sort of planted the seed in my head that I felt this seems to be reinforcing gender stereotypes. And I just never questioned it before. And then when I got to uni, it was the sort of symbols of gender identity theory were absolutely everywhere. So I had no choice but to think about it. And then in my second year, I spent a lot of time partying, frankly. In my second year, I was having a great time. So I wasn't really thinking about much in general. I'd always followed the news. I was always very listening to the radio all the time, following politics. But it was only really after Christmas and when I started at LSR in the February of 2024 where I became more engaged, because I was doing politics hour on LSR. So I was making sure I was definitely following things because I needed something to talk about every week. And the trans issue came up a couple of times, and I listened to a BBC Radio 4 podcast that had Susan Smith on, who's one of the directors of For Women Scotland, and we managed to get her on to do an interview with us. And at that point, I was doing more and more research, and then I sort of realised which side of the debate I came down on. And that's why I then decided to want to start my own podcast, because the dream was to go into radio, and I wanted to do something to stand out and take initiative and do something myself. So that's where it really started. And yeah, I wasn't really that political at all the first couple of years of uni. I've always been very opinionated and outspoken. At school, I was seen as, one of those girls who doesn't keep her mouth shut sort of thing. And actually, because I was quite at school, I did think an appropriate way to deal with people that didn't fall in line was to just silence them and to tell them that you can't say that.
So you can understand, and you're familiar with what that is.
Oh yeah,
yeah. And so what insight does that give you then into this kind of culture that's been created, where just shutting down is considered to be incredibly important, and that has a virtue in itself. So preventing things from being said that might hurt somebody is seen as being the kind of main step that you can take to make the world a better place.
I can only speak from my own experience, but that allows me to sort of hypothesize about what other people might have felt. I think that over lockdown, when again I was 15, 16, felt very powerless, except I had my phone and social media. And that was how we were communicating politically, by reposting infographics. And so it kind of gave you this, on one hand, a false sense of power, because you felt like you were part of something, whether it was Black Lives Matter, LGBT rights, or anything else like that. You had this power to make your voice heard, even if it was just people flicking through an Instagram story. But I wouldn't just do that. I'd also reply to people's stories and have debates with them. And so on one hand,
But what is that? But that experience of that happening online, I saw it with friends, daughters really. I didn't really see it as it was not a boy phenomenon,
no.
but I saw it was the girls who, I remember a friend's daughter who was placed under incredible pressure to put the black Instagram thingy, whatever you call it, graphic up to memorialize George Floyd. And but then that translated into actually going on the BLM kind of protests in London to the American embassy. And that, but it was a girl phenomenon of just this pressure on one girl who was a bit slow to put up the graphic. Now, so what is going on there?
I'm very ashamed to say that I was one of those girls putting pressure on. I thought that it was my duty to call out things that were wrong. I mean, in general, I feel like I've always had sort of, I describe it sort of a sense of justice and wanting, sort of understanding right from wrong and wanting to call out things that I thought were wrong. But I even remember on that it was called Blackout Tuesday. I didn't post the black square because I think even I could realize how ridiculous that was. And it annoyed me when I saw people posting the black square who'd not posted anything else the entire time. So I kind of think, well, I don't need to post a black square because I've been posting the whole time.
Because I'm already better
Yeah,
than everybody else.
But there was a girl that I'd never met before, but she had quite a large following relative to the town that I lived in. Never met her before. She was still posting selfies on Blackout Tuesday, hadn't posted a black square. And I replied to her story saying, "What do you think you're doing? It's Blackout Tuesday." Which is so embarrassing. But this is what I mean. It sort of gave this sort of, you had this sort of, you had this sort of weird political power to tell people what they should and shouldn't be doing for a cause I genuinely thought I was doing a good thing. Like, we were sat at home, didn't have the ability to do anything else. I mean, I did go to a Black Lives Matter protest in the local park where I lived, but that was, we were just making the best out of what we had, and that was social media. So I thought I was doing everything I could to make a difference.
So if you were to find something positive in all of that, so, being motivated and mobilized by a sense of justice, and it is kind of an interesting thing because injustice and the reaction to it is a very deep emotional response. And I was pretty much, I would have been like you, probably worse at that age. Certainly at university, I was always calling out. We didn't have that term, but I was calling out everybody left, right, and centre. I was a right pain in the neck. But at the same time, is that preferable to the thing that everybody was always previously concerned about, which was apathy and disengagement? So that was the kind of alternative, or complacency, or whatever it might be. So there must be something positive in that desire to kind of be part of the world and have some kind of impact on it. And I remember when the George Floyd killing happened, seeing the video, and obviously, and the idea in lockdown when you weren't getting out, looking at this horrendous snuff movie, basically, which I've never seen anybody killed on camera for real before. And yet there's this person almost expiring. He obviously died in the ambulance, I think, but almost dying on camera, which in itself is just a disgusting thing to watch, I think, and yet everybody was watching it, and it was all ages, and people were watching it multiple times, and probably doing like I was, where you watched it and you're kind of weeping in front of you with this incredible intensity, and then your only outlet for your experience of that is to talk to other people through social media, through WhatsApp groups or whatever it is you're using or projecting outwards. I mean, I kind of want people to react when somebody's killed by a police officer. And I know people now dispute that he was and all that, but nevertheless, that's what we felt like we were reacting to. And I wouldn't want to live in a world where people don't react to that. So how do we get the balance then? What is it that young people kind of need as a sort of a guide or as a better way of responding to things, which allows them to be passionate and to have that sense of justice, but doesn't lead them to take it out on their peer group?
I think it's a very unique case because obviously what happened to George Floyd, whatever people think about him as a person, whether they say that, well, he was a criminal and he was being arrested, that doesn't justify the way that he was killed, of course. And it was horrific. And I almost, like you say, it would be very strange, and I would be very concerned about myself if I didn't react in a sort of horrified way to seeing something like that. But the issue is that event then transpired into being a huge movement that then sort of had far-reaching consequences that sort of moved away from the issue at hand. And that was where, as a 15, 16-year-old, as many of my peers were as well, it just made sense that there would be a movement sparked by this, even if the movement started talking about then defunding the police as well. Like it just felt like a train that got carried away, and all of a sudden it's okay, someone's been murdered. Whether or not it did have something to do with his race, that's still still up for debate amongst people. That's not what I necessarily think. I never thought critically about it. I just assumed that, well, it must be because he's black. And I'm not saying that wasn't the case, but I never sort of questioned the other side. So, well, it has to be that. And then therefore it led on to this other movement where it was talking about loads of other things that, hang on a sec, what, we're defunding the police? And like, you can't, then young people weren't sort of being able to think critically and think, well, hang on a sec, yes, of course what's happened here is awful, and there needs to be a discussion about the way that minorities are treated by the police, but also, is this really an appropriate response?
So you go from this kind of, in a way, I don't mean you personally, but I mean generally society had this quite teenage response to something highly emotive.
Yeah.
And then that then gets attached or becomes a way of arguing much more serious policy kind of issues, or bigger kinds of framings of the world like white privilege and those kinds of things. So I wonder then what adults should be doing to help young people more to not to dampen down their ardor when it comes to injustice, or not to let them be callous, but at the same time helping them towards reason, I suppose, and at least a questioning kind of response. I mean, do you think adults have backed off from that? Do you think that the kind of ferocity of young people's response when adults try to say, well, let's try and look at the other side, that the ferocity of that, because it's so emotional, has become something that the reason gets lost? I mean, what do you think? I mean, how would you have reacted if adults had said to you, well, it's probably a bit more complicated than a 7-minute video suggests, or something like that?
I mean, I know that I had adults in my life who were reacting like that, and I was just very emotional about it. And like, how could you even, there isn't time to think about this, and how could you? I thought they were being pedantic by questioning anything. But the point is, you just have to keep questioning people, and that's often the best way to win with someone who, not necessarily win, but to sort of restore the reason and rationality when you're dealing with someone who is so hard on one side, who clearly isn't thinking about differing perspectives. Just to ask questions, that's the best way to deal with lots of situations like that. But it was just a very difficult time because adults were not on social media in the way that the children were. And I remember as well, another sort of source of this false sense of power was the fact that I knew, or at least I recognize now, and I wouldn't have sort of consciously said this at the time, but I knew deep down that I enjoyed this sort of satisfaction of being able to, I thought I could understand something that my parents couldn't. Whether that was trans ideology, sort of being able to work out an equation by understanding the terms, having to explain to my mum what these different terms meant, or sort of being very aware to the issues and to the struggles of certain people and being woke, being awoken to these things.
Yeah, which I think is really interesting because I think that, especially in the context of lockdown, where you're not going off doing a Saturday job, you're not going off, you're not even getting to go and study hard, you're not going to parties, you're not going on school trips, all of that, or to festivals where you're not really not having real experiences. Nevertheless, you don't stop growing up. And so, and growing up is about differentiating yourself from your parents and kind of cauterizing those attachments so that you can become an independent person. So I can see how the social media and the kind of virtual world became the only space through which you could make those kind of cut those connections. And certainly I saw an awful lot, particularly between girls and their mothers, of this kind of necessary separation happening, but happening in this incredibly difficult way, which wasn't necessarily through going out and staying out late and being staggering home, vomiting. It was through these kind of ideas and the sort of virtual world of saying, well, no, I understand this and you don't. It's like I would have said as a teenager, because I would have been out. No, I understand the risks and you don't even understand. You're so naive. You've never done the things that I'm now doing. All of those kinds of things where you're claiming some expertise, which is really important to do as a young person, because that's how you move forward. But I can really see how that was. So, but then to move on from that, how, presumably that has quite a serious knock-on effect at university if you have then academic staff who are not confident enough to kind of handle these highly emotional young people who are kind of busy um, asserting themselves against the older generation. And my experience towards the end of university was that I didn't feel that young people anymore really recognised the authority that you actually had as an academic, and they almost treated everybody like you're their mum to be rebelled against. I mean, how did you think academics responded to your peer group?
Well, unfortunately, I don't really have much of a substantial answer to give because my experience at university, ironically, considering my generation's or year group's experience over lockdown being extremely vocal, when I got to university, seminars were really quite disappointing because hardly anyone was prepared to say anything, regardless of what their point of view was. And it was a shame because I had that experience at school where not everyone was happy to share their view. So I thought, well, at least when I go to university, everyone is basically paying to do this now. And so everyone will be very excited to debate on a philosophy course. We're going to be debating different points of views, but that never really happened. Maybe it was the modules that I took. Other than feminist philosophy in my final year, that's the only module I've taken that's been quite contentious. But I know that from speaking to friends who do similar courses, they had the same experience of being sat in seminars and people just turn up and haven't done the reading. So, but even if they had done the reading, they don't want to express their views, and students don't like the idea of being picked on or being forced to speak in seminars. It's kind of like, well, what did you expect to be doing when you went to university and go to a seminar? So I can't really give an answer because I haven't been in that situation where an academic has had to deal with that. I mean, if anything, I could say in my feminist philosophy modules, the lecturers were the lecturer that I had was very good at sort of being relaxed and sort of didn't put their point of view across when we were discussing I was sort of on my own arguing from my point of view, and other people, I could tell people getting quite worked up about what I was saying, whether it was just sort of looks across the room or being quite hostile in their arguments, not necessarily the way they were saying, but what they were saying. I remember sort of suggesting to someone, oh, Blair White is a really interesting person who identifies as a trans person who identifies as a woman, and a student replying saying, well, I don't like Blair White, so I'm not going to watch that. And that was said in front of a lecturer, and nothing was said about that response. Whereas I'd like to think if I was a lecturer, I'd say, well, and this was my response, is that, well, I don't agree with Blair White either on many things. I also don't agree with many people that I still listen to make sure that I understand the other side of the argument and that I'm not caught in an echo chamber. But that is just sort of beyond the pale.
Well, I think, yeah, so this is the difference, is that, I mean, you're right, the underpinnings are a lack of rigor and an aspiration to hard work, which I think has been there for a really long time. So when I was a student, it was the same. And people turned up. I remember a lecturer walking out of our seminar group because he said, "I've had enough. You guys aren't reading. I'm going. And I'm not going to come back next week unless it's evident to me that you've read." And it did give us all a kick up the pants. And I did exactly the same thing when I was a lecturer. I had enough of one particular seminar group, and it was just like dragging teeth out. It was so awful because nobody would speak. And it wasn't just because it's kind of true that people are frightened of saying the wrong thing, but there's also a huge problem of young people just not being pushed and not being having very, very low expectations of them and excuses given all the time. And I think that that is prior to the kind of free speech crisis. People actually haven't got anything to say. I watched a debate, which we'll put in the show notes, that happened at Cambridge University. So the Vice Chancellor at Cambridge is kind of sponsoring these debates amongst academics, but to an open audience, and they're up on YouTube. And there was one about free speech last week that took place, and Lionel Shriver's on the panel, Kahindi Andrews from University of Birmingham, Farah Dabawala, who's written a history book on free speech. Lionel really was the only one who really put the case for free speech. But what was really notable is the whole thing kind of ran, the whole debate, and it was only 5 minutes from the end that one student stood up from the audience and said, free speech itself is an issue that we're not allowed to talk about on campus. And she was talking about the disparity between what it's possible to talk about on campus and what everybody else is talking about off campus. And I think that probably includes free speech as well. So off campus, normal people think that there is a free speech crisis, and it's tripping off the tongue that there's a problem with free speech. People are referring to Lucy Connolly. These kind of reference points have really taken hold in people's minds. Meanwhile, on campus, where there has been the most explicit kind of shutting down of free speech with no platformings and cancel culture really operating against staff and students, all of that kind of thing, that's the place where it's taboo to even talk about free speech, and it's seen as just a kind of a right-wing thing or a Tory thing, and the bill is seen as a Tory bill. Just this kind of deep cynicism, which I think runs really deep amongst academics, and by proxy then students will pick up on that as well, if they pick up on it at all. So, but this student was saying that that she was frightened even to speak in a free speech debate about free speech, to say that there is a free speech problem, and she worried about the consequences to that. And I just thought that was, and what was, I wasn't surprised by what she said, but what I was surprised by, that the panel were not visibly shocked by that. Because they should be visibly shocked. They were all academics, apart from Lionel Shriver, and they all were sort of, kind of shrugging, and that nobody really directly addressed her. And it was really, just an indictment really of how bad things are. So yes, we've got a long way to go to try to reactivate some kind of culture of academic freedom and free speech on campus.
I always think that people who react in that sort of indifferent way, who don't realise the extremities of it, is because they've never been in a position where they feel like they've never had a view before that has encouraged, or that does sort of result in backlash from people. And what's ironic about the idea that free speech is a right-wing issue and it's only to allow people to say really offensive things, is that, of course, naturally, at the moment, it is going to be the case that typically people who are concerned about free speech, a lot of them will be on the right, but that's because of the ebb and flow of societal political discourse, whereas originally free speech was a left-wing issue because they were the voices being silenced. And so one day this might all come back to bite people on the left, who are typically the ones saying that there aren't issues with free speech, particularly within universities, because if you do have sort of typical left-wing views, progressive views, you're not going to experience the backlash that other people do for having views that aren't seen as progressive. And so one day they might need the protections that the supposed right-wing free speech people are arguing for now. And that's what really frustrates me about it, is that if you can't see the issue of free speech at the moment, you kind of lack empathy, because you can't understand what it must be like to have an opinion that might mean that you've to not feel like you can express your opinion because of the backlash. Because lots of people will say to me, oh yes, but freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequence. What consequences do these people think that we should be having imposed on us for expressing our legal views? That's the very point of a democratic society, that there are some opinions, and only whether or not you agree with hate speech laws or not, there are only some things that we say shouldn't be said for sort of serious security reasons, for example. But yeah, I think it's a really lack of appreciation of other points of views. And that's what's really lacking in academia, is that some points of views are just not seen as being worth spoken about. And I don't know whether it was done intentionally, but when I was doing feminist philosophy last year, despite the fact that 40% of the module was about gender identity, there wasn't a single gender critical paper on the reading list, even though it's a very hotly debated topic. We were having debates within gender identities in what is the best way to define gender identity, rather than is gender identity a real thing or not. It was almost like, well, that doesn't, why would we even discuss that? Because of course everyone here believes in gender identity. So yeah, I think maybe one day, if society, like it normally does, sort of ebbs and flows in political discourse, and at some point people who don't see the issue now will one day realise the issue, and if they had appreciated it at the time, then their future selves, who might end up struggling, would have wished that they'd appreciated it, because free speech protects everyone regardless of what your views are. And that's what I think some of the panelists in that debate that you were talking about really don't appreciate.
No, and I think because their priority is their own notion of justice. So to go back to what we were talking about with young people, there's a sense that their own sense of moral justice, whatever that might be, and it's generally the same kind of thing, which is the kind of anti-oppression argument, that trumps everything else. That absolutely trumps freedom. So there's this weird kind of attachment to the freedom of the oppressed, but there's not really a sense of freedom more expansively and more profoundly, actually, about what that might mean. And because what kind of freedom do you want for the oppressed if it's not the freedom for them to be able to speak freely? What is it, that freedom? It's like literally you just want the oppressed to be a tool so that you can bash the majority, and there's not really any sense of freedom. So that kind of brings us right back round to Living Freedom Summer School, which was where I think you and I first met, which is a summer school that the Free Speech Union, through its Ian McTaggart programme, sponsors every year, and that's happening, I think, at the end of this month in London. Applications are already closed, so hopefully there should be a really good cohort of young people going through that experience, which will have an emboldening effect like it did on you. So great. Okay, well, we will wind up. Thanks very much to everybody for listening. I'm sure you'll hear from Connie again. She might bump me off the podcast now, I don't know. I've got to work out the personnel questions, but it's been really good talking to you. It's really good to kind of get to explore this stuff as it actually happens in the campus environment. So thanks very much for listening, everybody.